pressed against some things for so long, but I'm beginning in this portion of my journey to rediscover the value of so many things that I think the more that we question, sometimes people begin to push things out as if they're not important. And I think we have to be very careful that we don't critique what we believe so severely that there's nothing left of value at the end of the critique. And that's what people are afraid of when you start questioning things. They'll say, don't ask so many questions, it's a slippery slope. You ever heard that statement? Don't ask so many, don't argue with so much. It's a slippery slope, because if you start to doubt this, then maybe you'll doubt this, then maybe you'll doubt this, and the next thing you know, you'll doubt everything. And I agree that some things are slippery slopes, but we're never going to figure out how to get from point A to point B sometimes if we don't walk across the slippery slope. So there are some things we have to accept the challenge to go down that road. And as we sort of critique some of those areas of our theology, let's don't lose the things that are most valuable, because there are some things that are so valuable and things that need embraced. And so I want to take you on a little journey in Matthew's gospel tonight, and I want to meet you in chapter 6. And here's what I want to do. I love long blocks of text. I like breaking down context of text, and we're going to do that with some of this tonight. But before I do that, I really want to show you what I think is one of those hidden themes of the book of Matthew. Matthew's gospel, by the way, is Jesus speaking very pointedly to the nation of Israel. This is why the gospel of Matthew contains a lot of parables, a lot of parabolic phrases about judgment, contains a lot of statements about the generation that was going to eventually put Jesus on the cross, and it talks a lot about their prophets and the members of the Old Testament. And so that's why Matthew has some very interesting and intriguing ways of saying things. But I think there's an underlying ribbon. Jesus comes into a dispersed Israel. It's what theologians call the diaspora. The diaspora is the spread out tentacles of Judaism that had no home base. The Roman Empire is ruling the world with an iron fist in the time of Christ, and the Jewish home base is Jerusalem, but they don't have their own king. Herod's a vassal king that's been appointed by Rome, so they don't have their own bloodline on the throne. And Israel has sort of drifted into the far reaches of the empire. When you read Peter's epistle, he opens his first letter, 1 Peter, by saying, we write this to the dispersed abroad. And that word's capitalized in your translation. To the dispersed means to all of those of you who came out of Israel and have now spread like seed thrown into the wind across the Roman Empire. And so that's kind of what Jesus is dealing with, and he's making this clarion call. That's why you hear the phrase in Matthew's gospel, the angels will come from the north, the south, the east, and the west. Jesus is stating that's how far scattered you are, Israel. You're scattered to the north, the south, the east, and the west across the empire. And if my Father's going to bring any cohesion to this, the angels are going to have to draw you from the north, the south, the east, and the west. That's a metaphoric statement for, look how spread out you are. It would take God to bring you back together. It would take angels to bring you back together. And so there's this identity crisis that the more I study, the more I'm starting to see resembles the modern church, because the church in some ways is spread north, south, east, and west, as we are supposed to be. That's part of our mandate, right? We go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And so we're everywhere, and unification is a very difficult thing. We have a hard time getting unified about where we're going to eat lunch, much less the finer points of theology. I haven't been in a room with very many believers that walked out of that room believing 100% the same thing on any particular theological passage. I don't think that makes us divided as much as it shows us that we are a little bit scattered out there into the winds. And so to bring us together in anything, and take an act of the Holy Spirit. So we're a little bit like the Israelites in Matthew. We're a little bit scattered and a little bit spread. And when you get that way, you lose the roots. Over the last few years, one of the interesting things that Father's taken us on is this journey from the middle of the country, which is where I was born and raised in Missouri. And then we relocated to Southern California and spent a few years there and made wonderful connections and great friends and were blessed in ministry. And then God opened the door in North Georgia. And so I've lived in the middle, I've lived on the west, and I've lived on the east, I've lived in the south, I've lived in the Midwest. And so there's the interesting thing that I didn't understand about a lot of that when you're raised in the same spot is how much certain parts of you yearn for your roots, you know, kind of like you yearn for the food you ate. You took for granted that you always had growing up, and then you're going out and nobody knows what you're talking about, and that's a little disturbing. If you stay in the same spot your whole life, you get that when you go on vacation, okay? Try that. So especially if you go to a foreign country, and the Lord's taken us to Africa, and He's taken us to Asia, and you go into these places, and if you want to survive, you better eat what's put in front of you, or you're going to fast. You know, and that's okay. That's good. You embrace that culture. There's a little piece of you, though, that kind of yearns for that roots and yearns for the things that you understand. And the longer that you're spread, so you go from point A to point B to point C to point D to point E, it becomes easier and easier to lose cultural identity. And so you start to lose the connection with your home culture. And you start to pick up the culture that you have here, and then you move here and you start to pick up. So you lose a little bit of that cultural identity, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because I think embracing where you are is a pretty good thing if you're going to be happy and fulfilled where you are. But what happens when we start to lose any kind of identity is when identity takes a knock, we begin to lose a little piece of ourselves. And so this is why you see people who embrace the new land that they're in, but they hold on to the old land. They still fly the flag of their old land, and they still eat the food of their old land, and that's not always easy for people. I'm treading carefully here. That's not always easy for Americans, let's just say it that way, to see people who they keep holding on to their flag, and they keep holding on to their language, and they keep holding on to their food. The more you travel, the more you realize why you do that, because there's a little piece of yourself that if you lose that, you don't know who you are anymore. And you hold on to that because that's a rich part of your heritage. And as much as you embrace where you are, you never forget where you have come from. It's one of the things, believe it or not, that most closely connect you to God, is that God gave you what He didn't give dogs and cats and goldfish and birds. He gave you connection to places and people, and you can communicate with them and carry them with you into the future. You don't run on instinct, surviving just to get your next meal and just to mate and then move on to something better. You're so far advanced beyond that, and that is bittersweet. You know, it's like loving somebody. There's this beautiful euphoria in love, but what's the danger in love? Losing it. And so if you aren't willing to embrace the danger, then you're not going to get the good. And so there is that part of that. And so Israel is sort of like out, the tentacles are out across the nation, and they're losing that identity. And